Hello and welcome to Terrain Made Easy. My name is Jay and today I'm going to be talking about 3D printers and in particular what kind of 3D printer is best for terrain. Now I do appreciate that people coming into this video, there'll be like quite a varying degree of knowledge. There'll be some people who don't really know anything about printers and then some people who are way more knowledgeable than I am, probably even experts in the subject, but I will do my best to explain what kind of factors to consider with regards to terrain. Now, the two main types of printers in this case are FDM, and which sort of use filament. I'll explain a little bit more in detail in a moment. And then you've got the resin kind of printer. Now, you might have seen a little spate of YouTube videos at the moment from the likes of LukeAPS and Blackmagic Craft, people getting into the resin printing environment, and maybe like me, you are considering getting a resin printer. And then you've got people like Tabletop Minions, who has released a video talking about why he's not getting one, although I think he might have an FDM printer, not 100% sure, but essentially this is a subject that a lot of people at the moment are talking about, and really the reason for that is the price of resin printers has dropped significantly. You can now pick one up for about $200. So we'll talk more about which one's actually best for terrain in a moment. If though at the end of this video you like the video, do press like. If you're not subscribed to the channel and you're interested in terrain, well, that's what I do here, so please subscribe, it really would help. Now, caveat to all of this, I have just sold my FDM printer, but let's talk about how they work first. So the FDM printer generally works with melting what's called a filament. Generally PLA was the most common filament, essentially a little like thin strand of plastic. It gets melted at a very high temperature and it gets forced through like a little nozzle or extruded through a nozzle, and then as it comes through the plastic melts, and as it does that in the shape of whatever layer you want, and then it does the next layer, and then it does the next layer, all with the hot plastic coming through, getting melted, then essentially solidifying as it goes. Now, FDM printers generally have larger beds, which is one of the, if not the main consideration factor. But cost-wise, you can generally these days get an FDM printer from the likes of like $150 to X amount of dollars. Like they go, you can get printers like thousands and thousands of dollars, but you know, reasonably, they're probably a little bit cheaper than resin printers. And as I said, they melt the plastic as they go. Now, resin printers, they generally have just like one movable part. An FDM printer will generally have like a big N shape, and then either the bed will move, and then that it'll do it like that, so it's got all the degrees of access it needs, or the whole it'll be like a box, and the actual nozzle itself moves. Resin printers are a little bit different in that sense, in that they generally are working with just one movable part, and what it is the build plate. And what it does is it gets lowered into a vat of resin. Now that's liquid resin, so there are some health and safety risks there, or well, considerations, maybe not risks, depends on who you are and what you do with it. And the way that it works is there's a screen underneath, and that screen essentially casts UV light onto the liquid resin in a specific shape, which then dries on the base. So what happens is it's building up layers as it goes, gets cast in resin, gets cast with the UV light, and then goes up and down. Now the main problem with these is, well, there's smell and stuff like that, but the main problem in terms of terrain is actually the base size. So for an FDM printer, it's not uncommon to go from maybe like 15 centimeters to 20 centimeters. For a resin printer, I think it's more like 10 centimeters by 6 centimeters. So the size is a lot smaller. Now let's talk about quality briefly. We know that we've just talked about size. You can get really good FDM printers that with very fine nozzles that produce some amazing things that don't really have those classic layers that you see. But generally that's expensive or takes a lot of work to get to that point. Whereas with resin printers now, like LukeAPS, he bought the Elgu Mars, something like that, for like probably about £200, $200 in the UK. Well, $200 in the US, £200 in the UK. And the quality of those miniatures, yes, you can still see a little bit of like layering, but it's so much better generally on the resin quality. The quality of resin printers is generally so much better. Now, that's not to say, you know, there is a scale there. The more you pay on your resin printer, the better quality, but the more you pay on your FDM printer, the better quality. So there's obviously like a balancing act there. But at this stage, a cheap resin printer will print, say, like a miniature much better than an FDM printer would, right? But there are other pros and cons, and it mainly comes down to the size. Let's take, for example, you want to print a building. Maybe you play Star Wars Legion, or maybe you play Marvel Crisis Protocol, and you want to make one of those nice buildings, or even just the floor of the first building. Generally, you know, you can buy these buildings, the STL files from Corvus Terrain or Imperial Terrain, something like that. generally on an FDM printer, if you want to print that, let's say it's about 12 centimeters by 12 centimeters. I know Corvus Terrain, they actually make it so you can generally print them on about a 10 centimeter one, but it's still reasonably large, right? And then you've got the, as tall as whatever one floor, one story is. Those buildings generally take between 10 and 15 hours. That is a long time. However, you can print it because it comes out in one piece. Now, if you try to do that with a resin printer, well, you can't really. It's just not big enough. The build plate, the build amount, just isn't big enough to have a 10 by 10 by 10 or whatever, because it's an LCD screen and the cost of the screens must obviously be prohibitive in terms of reasonable consumer use, plus the fact that you need a lot more resin, and resin is in itself a little bit more expensive. But there you have it. You can't build those big buildings very easily. You could, in theory, try and chop up the building so that you actually just glue the building together in parts. But really, the bigger the object, the easier it is to do it on an FDM printer, and the harder it is to do on a resin printer, if not impossible. And when it comes to terrain, I think that is a massive consideration for people. And the size is actually one reason I've got rid of my FDM printer. For those of you who don't know, my wife is pregnant, so my room that was my hobby room, essentially I've been kicked out of that, and having my big 3D printer in this little room is not really feasible, whereas I could possibly fit in a resin printer. So the machines for the FDM are generally actually bigger than the resin printers, which makes sense because you can build bigger things on them. The caveat to that is, yes, you can build these buildings, but the time that I mentioned, 10 to 15 hours, can really put people off. Now, it's worth noting here that I don't think resin printing speed is actually that much difference from an FDM printer. I haven't checked that up, but I think they're probably reasonably about the same. So I mentioned that if you wanted to build a building, you're looking at like 10 to 15 hours. I never wanted to leave my FDM printer unmonitored. I didn't want to leave it whilst I was outside or, at work, something like that. I really wanted to be in the house at least, if not in the same room or monitoring it on like a CCTV-esque kind of setup. And doing that means I can only really print at weekends. Obviously, if I have the printer in here, I can't really make videos at weekends, and no, I no longer have my room. But even doing it at weekends basically means every weekend you would have to set it up and print it. And it just got to a point where I didn't want to invest that amount of time. And there's all kinds of reasons why prints can fail, by the way. I won't go too much into detail here, but maybe the filament can get caught, or the power goes off, or it just doesn't stick the way you expect it to. It comes off the printer or what have you. So the fact that I was essentially limited to weekends only if I was going to do the big projects means I've just not really used it. So what does that leave us with? And I think this is the solution that a lot of people are coming to now, and that is the idea of actually having a resin printer but combining it with traditional terrain making techniques. So you might use the resin printer to print like your doors or your windows or your control panels, but maybe you would build your building in a traditional sense, maybe just foam board, and then you add a nice door to it, etc. And I think a lot of people are sort of coming to that point because the quality that you can get with those greebles is just really good. And there's a lot of people like me who don't really have massive bits boxes. I can't pull out a hatch whenever I need to. That would say, hey, well, if I had a 3D printer that can do really high quality little things like that, I could print out my hatch and stick it onto my building. There's a lot of opportunity there to have this combination. And if you're going to print something small, well then a resin printer is only going to take a couple of hours. Yes, you could still do it on an FDM printer, but the quality difference and the size, etc., is something you might need to consider. So they're your two options. If you want to print something big, it's not that you want to even print it, you just want a terrain piece that's big, right? You either buy a FDM printer or you use a resin printer and you slice it up into little parts and glue it together. I don't really think that's too feasible, if I'm honest. Or you have a resin printer and you print the little greebles or the doors and the windows and you stick that to a traditional kind of terrain method. And I think that's what people like Luke KPS, I'm pretty sure he's essentially bought it for that purpose, are going to be doing. And I know I've had discussions on Facebook and in Discord. A lot of the community, or some of the community that I'm talking to, are essentially considering doing just that. And I've got to admit, I'm one of them. There are downsides to resin printers though, don't get me wrong, the smells, health and safety concerns with the odours and that kind of stuff, and all different kinds of stuff, like you need alcohol to clean it, the process might be a little bit more difficult, but there are your two options. You buy a large FDM printer and you just print it and it takes many, many hours, or you buy a resin printer and you print the little small things that you then put on your traditional kind of terrain techniques. For my lifestyle, as of right now, the fact that I don't have my hobby room, I've been kicked out of that, it's becoming a nursery, means that I've sold my FDM printer. I could possibly get a resin printer and stick it on my little Kallax shelves here. The downside to that is it's a very small room. Ventilation would be an issue with very stinky resin. But you know, I can't really have everything. I don't really have another alternative, so maybe I will, maybe I won't. I'm not 100% sure. Let me know if you're going to buy either of these. I'm very intrigued at the moment. Now, I personally have a separate concern to all of that. The fact that this is a terrain channel, I generally like to have my terrain use materials that people can get access to. Like, you can literally go on Amazon, go on Facebook, buy this exact thing and do this exact thing. I don't really like seeing videos where people are using this one unique item that only they would have access to. I don't like seeing something that I can't replicate. Doing a 3D printer essentially says, hey, unless you have a 3D printer, you can't do this exact build. So whether or not it's even something I'm going to do, or whether that's just something I just want to enjoy, maybe doing like miniatures, I don't really have the answer, but that's not a concern for most of you, I would imagine. So ultimately, there is no correct answer for this. There is no right choice. It's the choice that fits you the best. Cost-wise, we're looking at very similar pricing, really. Quality-wise, we are looking at better quality for resin, but you're again limited by the size. FDM, you can print larger things, but the quality is generally just a little bit not as good as the resin printer. And then you've got to consider, do you have the time to actually print your massive thing, or do you want to do traditional methods and combine it with the resin printer? Those sort of your options. There is no right answer, I don't think. Maybe we'll see in the future, maybe Luke's APS stuff will just be so incredible that everybody will rush out and buy one. But you know, ultimately at this point, I don't know. I think if I buy one, it's not something that I'll necessarily share on the channel, because I like people having access to stuff. But the cost of 3D printers are dropping, more and more people are buying them, and we're seeing like crazy technology. I know the Hero Forge 2 Kickstarter has just gone live, and that's actually promising like coloured miniatures, which is insane as a concept. Granted, the printer that they're actually using for that costs upwards of $200,000, so that's not in the realms of consumer pricing just yet, but we can imagine costs will come down. Inevitably the costs will come down, and maybe we'll get a printer like that people can have for like 300 quid, something like that. You can have a printer that does quality coloured things. That's like, sounds insane, but I think like inevitably in 10 years time that could happen. So the future's interesting. For now, we're in this weird hybrid stage that we don't really know the best usage of 3D printed stuff in terms of terrain. You'll just see stuff on Facebook, somebody will print like amazing like spaceships, TIE fighters, etc. And they don't really tell you how long it took, and they don't tell you how much effort went into. You just see the picture on the screen and you're like, damn, that looks good. It's not really replicatable for a lot of us. So they're my considerations. You've got cost is about the same, size is one of the main things, and then you've got quality. Those really are your three consideration points, and I've hopefully explained where they fit. Let me know your thoughts. Do you own a 3D printer? Did you maybe have an FDM printer and you're considering getting a resin one, like this guy here? Or maybe you didn't have either and you're now considering, now that the prices are dropped on both of them, you just pick up one of them and be done. Let me know. I'd be very intrigued where you fit on this. Do subscribe if you're interested in terrain. There will be more and more tutorials coming. One of the reasons I didn't do a tutorial this week is I pushed out, well, I made this barricade and I hated it. So I learned my lesson to not push out content. I really just want to, when I do terrain, I'm going to make it the best that I can make it in terms of quality of video, not necessarily in terms of the best terrain you've ever seen. So I've decided occasionally I'll just do these talking videos on the Friday, and that'll essentially be instead of doing the terrain video, which I am working on stuff, not that you can see because it's all blurry. So more terrain definitely on the way. Have a most beautiful day. Do like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on 3D printing. Goodbye.